All right. Thank you, everyone, for joining us for Recovering the Past, a queer true crime panel. We are just going to start the panel after a short video from our sponsors. So while I cue that up, let's get the screen share going. Audio. All right. And we just want to say thank you to AIDS Healthcare Foundation and Gilead, our center's Arts Platinum partners, for making OutWrite and other arts programming out of the DC Center possible.
My name is Paul Ramos. I'm an MA, Medical Assistant PCS2, and I've been in a company for 5 years. I choose to work in AHF to carry the heart and soul for my dad, my late dad. He was diagnosed with HIV and AIDS. Every time I see a patient, I know that he's looking over me and he knows that I did it for him.
Buenos días, mi nombre es Zoraida Jiménez y soy la manager de práctica de la oficina de Falls Church in Virginia. So what has surprised me more about the company culture is my immediate manager taking her time to really train me one-on-one, making sure that I understand and I do the job that I need to do to succeed in my role.
Hi, my name is Simply Sandy. I'm a non-medical case manager here at the K Street location. I chose to work at AHF because it is a phenomenal company. The company allowed me to spread my wings, if you will. They allowed me to continue doing what I love to do, and that's serving the public. I feel as though we are a family, and I could not do what I do by myself.
My name is Dominique Morrow. I'm the office administrator for the Temple Hills AHF location. I choose to work for AHF because I like to give back to my community. My favorite thing about working with AHF is how much the organization gives to the community, how they help our patients, help them grow, the tools that they give them that our patients can't find at any other clinic.
The thing that surprised me about working for AHF, which I enjoyed, the teamwork, the employees. It's a really great work environment. You look forward to actually getting up and coming to work. AHF is one of those companies that I will say that really looks out and really cares about their employees.
My name is Sade. I'm a technician here in Baltimore, and I work with AHF because I really enjoy taking care of my patients, and I like their mission statement of being patient first, of putting patient care over profit, and getting our co-pays as close to zero as possible. I love that part.
The average baseball stadium holds about 50,000 people, enough to fill a dance floor the size of a New York City block. It was also the number of people in the US who became HIV positive every year since 2003. Then, something happened. One by one, we said, enough is enough. Instead of waiting for a cure, we took action. We got tested and retested. We talked to each other, and we talked to healthcare providers about HIV prevention options. People living with HIV started treatment right away and stuck to it, which can prevent the spread of HIV through sex. New infections went down, but we still have work to do. So let's all do our part and keep fighting, because together we can all help stop the virus. Find out what you can do at helpstopthevirus.com.
My name is Paul Ramos.
Great. Thank you so much, Emily. I am very happy to be here with these true crime writers. I am John Copenhaver, and I am not a true crime writer, but I am a mystery writer and a huge fan of true crime. And I thought that it would be a really interesting endeavor to talk about and gather some true crime writers who are also identify queer and in some cases, and in most cases, do address those issues in their true crime writing. Hopefully our fourth, Emma will be here and show up. We've had some tech issues. If she does, we will take a moment and introduce her. But I'm going to take a minute and sort of invite each writer to the stage to say a little bit about the work that they've been doing and as it pertains to a book or a series that they have. And I'm going to start with Bobby Fieseler, who wrote the tremendously good and Edgar-winning Tinderbox. Bobby, will you talk a little bit about this book?
I just liked what you were saying, so I wanted to listen to it as well. My name is Bobby Fieseler. So I'm a subculture reporter who reports on marginalized groups. I'm also an historian and book author who excavates forgotten histories. So the book that you just introduced, that was my debut book that I wrote about, which is sort of the same deal of what my second book is, but is in terms of it was a little known aspect of queer history that had a very, very strong true crime element that I then reported in a scenic or narrative way to kind of in a lyrical sort of in a plot driven sense allow a wider readership to learn about, and hopefully a wider queer readership to learn about an event that they hadn't known about before. And what was the event? The event was Tinderbox is about a true story. It's a nonfiction account of the upstairs lounge fire in 1973 New Orleans. So it's a notoriously unsolved arson fire that took place at a gay bar in 1973 New Orleans, and it claimed 32 lives. It was the deadliest fire on record in New Orleans history and the worst mass killing of homosexuals in 20th century America. And yet, despite all of that, it received just a few days of media attention in its time due to rampant anti-gay bigotry. And despite a bounty of evidence pointing towards a chief suspect, an internally conflicted gay for pay hustler named Roger Dale Nunez, this crime, this widespread societal violation was deemed in its time, even in a queer city like New Orleans, politically inconvenient due to its homosexual overtones, and thus was it permitted to become the historic mystery that it remains to this day now. Like the upstairs lounge is still an unsolved crime. And I should also say a bounty of evidence that's been brought forward and a lot of scholarship that's happened and has drawn recent attention to this event, which only starting a few weeks ago this summer eventually has led to New Orleans authorities contemporarily finally acknowledging the event in legislation, apologizing for it. And then a week ago, I testified before the New Orleans City Council to try to get them to help right one of the most grievous historic wrongs that happened in the upstairs lounge tragedy, which is 3 unidentified victims who had families who did not step forward to claim them after the fire, and also 1 identified victim, a World War II veteran named Ferris LeBlanc, were buried in a potter's field on the edge of town. And then the records were sort of lost or thrown away. No one really understands it. The cemetery vacillates on what happened to the records. But so the New Orleans City Council just last week put forward a vote to cut some of the red tape to allow families that are interested in exhuming those unidentified and then the identified bodies and then the identified person to receive some amount of restitution and to be able to bury those people with the appropriate honors. So the upstairs lounge fire was so messed up in the past, like many aspects of queer true crime, and so swept under the rug that it remains contemporary news.
Yeah, that's amazing. It's amazing. You're right. It's the news is still ongoing with this thing, which you know, I think any other sort of situation, we would not be in this place if it hadn't been so underreported and so much homophobia. Our next speaker is James Polchin, and his book, Indecent Advances, is amazing book, Edgar nominee. Well, I won't speak for him. I'll let him speak for it. But James, take it away.
Great, thank you, John. Right, so Indecent Advances is a catalog, really, of crimes, murders, and assaults of queer men in the decades before Stonewall, and it really sort of plots out decade by decade the kinds of stories in the newspapers, some sensational stories to sort of smaller localized stories, national stories, that document the ways in which queer men became targets, became sort of victimized both on the streets, I say, but also victimized in the courtrooms. So some of these articles really detail how the courtroom processes happened. But at the same time, in telling these true crime and recovering all these crimes as they were published in the newspapers, I'm also telling a story about the transformation and contradictions around theories of homosexuality from the 1920s and 1950s, and so one of the premise of the book is that through the crime stories, you can really see how the ideas about homosexuality were getting played out in the popular press, right? And so those are sort of the two threads within within that book, seeing how these crimes were reported, but also how they reflect broader sociological, psychological understandings of homosexuality, and then ultimately how these crime stories were then borrowed and used by the early homophile groups as a way to start thinking about homosexuals as a minority group, right? As victims of violence in a particular way, right? And so that's the history that the book tries to map.
It's sort of interesting because it is a catalog. It's a bunch of crime stories, really, kind of all woven together with a thesis. And I think that it's so compelling to sort of see that. I know when I was, I told you this in person, I was researching my first novel about that time, about the 40s and 50s. I wish I'd had in your book. I was like, I got it out. I was like, I know, I needed this. Okay, for our third speaker, Al Warren. And a series, this is just the first one of his Killer Queen series about gay men who commit crimes and sort of how they're treated. Al, you want to chat a little bit about that?
Yeah, the series is kind of, it represents different areas. So I've gone to different countries like the United States with Chicago with Leopold and Loeb. At the same time in the 20s, I talk about Fritz Harman, the butcher of Hanover, and the vast differences between the two countries at the exact same time of how they thought of gay men, and the difference of the way they were treated when they were caught committing the crimes that they did. There's quite a difference in just the society and what was going on in, let's say, Berlin as compared to Chicago. And so I just sort of, I lay out that, as well as with that, how law enforcement dealt in both cases. And so it's kind of shows you two extremes at the same time. And it's very interesting. And with Leopold and Loeb, it's even more interesting because you've got two gay men primarily committing crimes, not just the murder. They committed quite a few crimes, but kind of being into the philosophy of Nietzsche and being supportive of Hitler in Germany, meanwhile being gay, and actually one of them being Jewish. So it just kind of covers a lot of different aspects that happens socially and with the law enforcement, with the police. And so when I'm continuing that through each country, I've got one coming out for Canada and one in Australia and one in England, which is the Grinder serial killer, which just came out too. So that's kind of the premise. It's more about looking at it from society and law enforcement and how they treat crimes, because a lot of people in those times especially thought of homosexuality as a crime or an illness. And so with that, they put them on the same level as criminals as it was.
Great. Thank you. Yes. And I think it's fascinating to think about how they were treated often, and how there's a lot of confusion purposefully made between their sexuality and their criminality, right?
Yeah.
So I want to jump into our sort of conversation. And this is really a question for everyone, but I'll probably kind of, just the nature of this Zoom is to sort of, ask individuals, but hopefully it will flow out. But the first general question is, as a writer and also as a person that, identifies as LGBTQ, what initially drew you to true crime, and or why do you find it so compelling? And let's begin with Bobby.
Okay, so I'm not a true crime reader in general. I was initially drawn to this field because I'm a reporter. I come at things from a journalistic background, and like straight news follows the format called LIRC B, lead, impact, react, quote, and then B is the part that I liked the most, which was background. And if you just get into background more, that's all history, historical context. And the more that you blow out long form narratives in journalism, the more historical context and the more background you get, up to the point that you have a book length background book. And most stuff isn't then contemporary current news. It's just it's unsettled things from the past that continue to impact us in the present moment, and it turns into that sort of thing. And so I was drawn to it because you learn about historical events or historical quagmires, and as a queer person, you're drawn to certain stories. So I heard about the Upstairs Lounge fire. I was living in Brooklyn, New York at the time. I'd never been to New Orleans, even though I'd promised myself. I was like a teenage kid that liked Anne Rice in high school. And then like in college, I read Christopher Rice's first book, A Density of Souls. Like my first boyfriend and I read that together, which had bisexual stuff in it. And I promised myself at some point, like I was going to go visit New Orleans and have this whole amazing excursion. I never went. Okay, so then I heard about this terrible fire that was unsolved, that had unidentified victims, that happened in the early 1970s, and just something weird clicked in my brain and I had to go. So I just I booked a plane flight. I flew there. I only knew 2 people in town and I stayed with them. Girl, I was like a bad house guest too. I stayed with her for a long time. Like I was like, I became like a permanent house guest and they became like my best friends. And I started delving into this historical event first from paper documentation, and then trying to find ways to sort of burrow into the secretive sexual subculture that actually still exists in the French Quarter. Like, how could I find my fixers or my keys into those secret windows? And then eventually that obsession just continued to the point where I had enough material and I thought, I'm going to put together a proposal. And I put together a proposal and showed it to an editor, who laughed at me and told me it sounded like a tabloid book. And then that same editor gave me such good notes that it was like I was trying to figure out ways to how do I incorporate more historical context? How do I broaden the subject matter to incorporate the realities of gay liberation, all the contemporaneous social justice movements, and the Vietnam War, all those things that are occurring in like the 1973 time period, to the point where they took it and ran with it. And then suddenly I was writing a book. And that eventually led to, and I had a contract, so you can't get out of it, and so you're going to have to do it. And and eventually I finished it, and I turned it in, thinking I'd written like just a historical, like a reported journalistic piece that's about history. And my editor told me it was true crime. So like I was like, okay.
Yeah, I guess it's a little bit to sell it, I imagine. That has to be playing into it a little bit, right?
Right. And then that came into play in terms of what sort of cover they selected, and also it came into play in terms of when you start publishing, when you publish the book and tour it, the kinds of readers that come forward that are true crime readers as opposed to queer history readers are very different, and I found that really interesting and wonderful. So that was sort of the little backwards process whereby I ended up in this space. But otherwise, like I hadn't read any of the true crime classics besides like maybe In Cold Blood. Like I only read David Grann's book, like Killers of the Flower Moon, like later on. I did everything wrong. But like I still think it's a fascinating genre, and I'm encouraged that it seems to be growing a bit more. Although I will say that there are various QPOC voices that are not being included in the genre, and there's not an incredible there's not a really strong non-binary or trans perspective yet incorporated into the genre.
Yeah, I definitely agree there, which I think we'll touch on and think about some in a minute. Al, talk. You've been a lifelong or a long time true crime writer, and so sort of what drew you to it initially, and maybe a little bit why did you pivot to sort of queer stories as well? Because not all of your true crime is necessarily LGBTQ.
Yeah, no, I'm radio guy. So, and when I got my own show 10 years ago, it was really centered on mysteries and like unsolved mysteries. But so I was kind of dealing with a lot of crime that hadn't been solved and bigger events too, like JFK or Jack the Ripper and stuff like that. I never thought about writing. That isn't something that was in my mind. But then a few papers asked for a few articles. Then Serial Killer magazine wanted something, and then a publisher came to me and wanted some short reads, part of a series, and one thing led to another. And I've got 30 books published now, and most of them true crime, or some cult, and some other things. But and so the reason I went into the queer area was because I think that it's not done enough. It's not a big part of the true crime area, and it hasn't been. And I think a lot of it has been ignored, perhaps. And also, I think if it's going to be done, it's got to be someone done from the community, because there's aspects of our community that straight writers just aren't going to be able to get, or they're not part of it. They're not living it. They haven't lived it, so they can understand it. But if they're not living in it, they're missing something. And also, there's a different aspect to when you're treated differently because of who you are, as compared to someone that gets to choose whether to treat you that way or not. So that in itself, as a writer, I think makes a difference. I'm fairly basic and fairly honest with things like that. It's not like I'm not like a classic writer like Rob or James, perhaps, like you know what I'm saying, a traditional writer. They're very good writers. I'm just a pretty honest guy that worked on the radio, that just writes out how I see it. So and that's kind of how I take it. That's how I write it.
James, now, I mean, it's sort of interesting because I feel like in a lot of ways, when I was thinking about the title for this, this panel, I was thinking about recovering the past, and I feel like your book does that. It feels, but what drew you to true crime? Which I feel like we kind of have to put in quotes because some of us are gathered under that, but we're all very different, which is kind of my next question. But James, what drew you to it?
Yeah, we are very different, but I mean, Mayan has that term in the title, right? And that was part of the sort of negotiation with the publisher in terms of having that in the title, right? I think for marketing and other things, but certainly, for many years, I'm a professor at NYU. For many years, I taught a course on the history of murder, right? And it was looking at the stories of murder from the early 19th century up until mid to late 20th century, right? And the whole premise of the course was through these stories, we can get at the bigger kinds of concerns of each of those generations, right? Of each of those eras. We can really get at something by looking at those stories of murder and questions of justice and questions of sanity, questions of psychology, right? And also questions of storytelling, like how do you tell the story of a murder, right? It's not like given from high on high, I wish, but it's not, right? So how are different eras structuring that story, right? And so that led me into my own work, my own research into queer history. One of the things that really struck me early on in research was books like Gay New York, right? These really sort of seminal books that recover the queer past, really sidestep any violence, any crime, anything that was not about kind of a celebration of a queer culture that thrived despite all the discrimination and all the difficulties that queer people had to navigate in that era, late 19th, early 20th century. And then I came across some scrapbooks of Carl van Vechten, and Carl van Vechten was a writer and a photographer in the 20s, 30s, up until his death in the 60s. And he was a hoarder in many respects. He collected a lot, and he collected all of these pamphlets and flyers from drag balls and queer publications through the 30s to the 50s, basically. And he started composing these scrapbooks, these queer scrapbooks that also included photographs he took of men, naked men having sex that he took photographs of. It was this whole collage of homoeroticism that he both preserved, but also was, kind of creating this stuff. And so I was doing research in these scrapbooks, and I saw all these little snippets, these newspaper articles of murders, of crimes that were clearly coded, right, at certain times where the newspaper couldn't make it explicit, the nature of the two men and their relationship and why they ended up in a hotel room, for example. But here they were in Van Vechten scrapbooks as part of a kind of queer history that he was preserving. And so I knew about all those drag balls and other things that he was collecting about the culture of those decades, but I didn't know about these crime stories. And so that led me into the newspapers and started to research, because I thought, if Van Vechten's doing this in the 50s, those newspaper articles of crimes must have meant something to him, such that he was cutting and pasting and putting them in these scrapbooks, right? They weren't just ephemeral queer life. They were part of, next to, drag balls, homoerotic images, and so forth. And so that led me into researching into the newspapers and into the archives as far as I could get initially.
It's really interesting. I think we're kind of circling this a little bit. So I'm going to launch it to my next question and start with Al, which is sort of this idea of like each of you have a different approach to writing this, right? In fact, and I do want to, I'm not sure if Emma's going to be able to join us, but I want to flash her book as well. It's a really wonderful book, The Third Rainbow Girl. And she weaves her own personal story with a true crime story that she's researched. So she's pulling in her own life. Now, each of you do this a little differently. James, it's more sort of a series of stories, or as a catalog, as you put it. Bobby, it's more like a sort of rich, like detailed story, not just of the crime, but of the aftermath and the city, and it feels so like stuck in, or not stuck, but focused on place is the word. And then Al, it's more like a direct true crime story. You sort of said you just sort of tell it, but I think you're not giving yourself enough credit. But I think, like, why is it, just your training that brings you to this different way of telling? Would you ever tell a story differently, a true crime story differently? What do you think, has drawn you to this way of telling? Al, I'm going to start with you.
Ooh, I think the ultimate goal would be to write like In Cold Blood, where you actually have a lot of emotion and meaning and a lot of layers to a book. I don't know that I'm capable of such a feat, but that would be the goal. But to be honest too, you also have to deal with a lot of the books I've written have covered crimes that people are still alive and people are still part of it. And so with a lot of the cases, you got to remember that they're still there, like victims and victims' families and stuff. So a lot of it, I've had them part of the books, so to speak. I've had them write parts and be involved in it because it's important to them. So in that case, that kind of makes it harder to do it like an In Cold Blood. You know, I don't know if that makes sense. I think because I'm trying to tell their story from my point of view, but not let a lot of my feelings mix into what they want or what they want to get across. So I think that's where my style comes from. So when I take on a book like Leopold or something like that, where nobody is alive, I kind of have to read it from their words, from what they've said, and try to make it into a story. But that's as far as I've come as far as that. Like, you know, the richness or something. It's not like Rob's, where there's a lot of interaction and a lot of feelings with people alive. So that's probably why I write the way I write.
James, what about you?
Yeah, as Ellen was talking, it was making me think about the the story is always dependent on how much material you have to work with, right? With true crime, right? I'm very diligent to not go too far from the facts, because there are those in the field who do, right, to imagine more beyond the facts, and I don't want to do that. I didn't want to do that, at least in this book, in the Indecent Advances. And so you're kind of limited. And for me, I was very limited just by these newspaper articles, which were incredibly difficult to find because, as I note in the book, it really wasn't until the newspaper databases became digitalized that I was able to actually do searches through newspapers and find these crime stories. Before that, it wasn't, you couldn't go to the New York Times Index and look up queer crimes 1930 and see what's been published, because that wasn't at all indexed, right? And so it became a huge hurdle just finding the articles. And then one of the motives for me in writing the book was to give readers a sense of what it was like to encounter these articles in the daily press, right? Because I do think that while we say that queer life was kind of underground, right? It wasn't so well known. These crime stories circulated across the country, regional newspapers, local newspapers. There's one, the press, and however problematic these stories are, it was a way that people encountered queer experiences, and particularly by the 40s and 50s, the stories were more detailed. And so, you would see where the victim and the murderer met, what bar they met at. And so it started to create a whole world of queer experience through these crime stories, right? And so what I was trying to do in writing is just trying to get at what was the experience of reading these stories within that time period, right? And so contextualizing those stories within the Depression era, contextualizing it within the post-war period and the kind of rising Lavender Scare, Red Scare, rhetoric that was, and so to take those stories and try to situate them for the reader within those context through the decades.
Great. Bobby?
Well, there's something tremendously exciting, right, about being like a sort of modern day Sherlock Holmes and getting to do that as a grown-up. Like, I read a lot of Arthur Conan Doyle growing up. And so like when you, and I think a lot of us are drawn to this aspect of it, and readers are excited by that aspect of these sorts of this sort of nonfiction storytelling, where you as a contemporary consulting detective, whatever, someone that's coming totally out of left field. And so generally the wrongdoers will be caught in an act of surprise. They don't know you're coming. You can investigate past wrongdoing. Then you can interrogate the people that were involved at different points, or, question the victims and things like that. And then at the end, you can indict, right? Which is like such a fun thing that you can do. It's like, I was raised Roman Catholic, so pardon this an analogy, but you're almost like, you get to be like the angel Michael with the flaming sword casting Satan out of paradise. I mean, it seems like you, and there's something very satisfying about doing that. Now, if it occurs within the context of journalistic discipline, like I have, there is emotional restraint, and there obviously has to be offsets to that natural impulse. But also, that's the passion that drives, I think, the writer to try to solve things, or to, in some ways, bring things to rights by allowing the sunshine of the truth on events that weren't seen, or or in another sense, perhaps providing some modicum within the lens of history of justice being applied towards things that were unjust in the past. So like all true crime, I think, operates in the space of violation to a certain extent, right? Like we present in either in piece, a collage of them, or one event or one character, etc. We present like a violation of some seemingly unbreakable human norm, moral, legal, otherwise, right? And then we attempt to square that violation through story with a world that we thought we knew before, right? And whatever we thought reality, however we thought it was organized in our minds, it gets shattered by a new thing. As that's what happened to my mind when I heard about the upstairs lounge fire and what happened to the victims, what happened to the families of the individuals who died there. It was ghastly. And then after you experience that shock and devastation, that fractures your understanding of what is true, what is real, what is good, all those things, then your story, the reporting, the putting together of the book attempts to repair that break and reconciles the violation with a new and bigger picture of the world, and I would say better picture of the world, built from the shards of the old one, right? And if the book succeeds, you gain this more realistic vision of who we are as human beings and what we're capable of, which is what I think most people, through all of our ideological BS, don't understand. We fundamentally forget that, human beings are capable of good things, revelation, justice, also, fundamental acts of decency, but also we're just, monkeys walking around wearing clothes, right? And we're an incredibly violent species still, and we're still resolving a lot of these aspects. I think of a quote, this is a problematic author too, so I wanted to include it. This is Robert Louis Stevenson's quote, which, and granted, this quote that he said should apply to him and all of his work. But anyways, he said, sooner or later, everyone sits down to a banquet of consequences, right? And that's what a lot of laying things out in a true crime format is about having people finally set down who avoided culpability in their own lifetimes, or entire societies in some cases, sit down to their banquet of consequences. A lot of us walk around in life thinking we're getting away with it. And a lot of us are, okay? A lot of us are. But when viewed through the lens of history, right, and when viewed through the lens of true crime, individuals who escaped the human law of what goes around comes around can be reconsidered and reanalyzed within the context of what we do, and be forced to face the fallout of their choices, and that's tremendous. It's a very exciting thing, but also face the fallout of their choices fairly, I would say, and not in a way that where it seems like the author is joyously destroying a wrongdoer or someone who commits a violation, but doing so in a way that's educational, that's enlightening, that reveals something more profound and broader about all of us in the context of a story, which is what I think all of us do in some ways. When we depict the criminal at length, what is the purpose of doing that? Is to showcase for us insights that can be gained and gleaned about the human condition from the even abominable behavior of others.
Yeah. And if I can follow that, because you're reminding me, Bobby, like one of the challenges for me, and I think for all of us in the work we're doing with queer true crime, is that I was trying to write a story against the sensationalism that was made of these cases, right? I was trying to write a story that didn't make the victims a double victim once they made it into the press or in the courtroom, right? It was because, the criminalization of homosexuality made justice a really difficult process for these victims and the families of these victims, right? And so, certainly your book, Bobby, like tries to recover a different story here, right? A story that is not the sensationalized, problematic representation at the time it was reported, right? And so that was a constant in my mind as I was writing, and I think that is often the case with queer historical crime, right? You have to work against the narratives that were presented at the time to tell it in a different way, from a different perspective, right? From a different angle.
You know, I keep on thinking about this, and Al brought him up, and we talk about true crime. You can't avoid In Cold Blood and Truman Capote. You know, of course, famously in Cold Blood, there are a lot of questions about, you know, he certainly took a lot of creative license. I mean, I don't think most folks would argue about it being an incredible book, but people do argue about whether it's all terribly accurate. He also was, I think, attempting to do what you're just talking about, James, is try to shine light on it, you know, I think Perry Smith, particularly, and his, you know, latent or suppressed queerness, you know, it comes through. It's not like, you know, but it's there. And certainly Capote was gay. So, you know, I don't know. I guess my question really is like that wrestle between wanting to tell a good story, wanting to make great art, and then also being kind of wedded to fact. Can you each maybe share a story about that struggle for you? Like, or was it a struggle? Maybe this wasn't a struggle, but from the perspective of a fiction writer, which is what I am, that would be a struggle. Let's start with Al. Why don't we start with you?
Yeah, I think that the toughest part is see, how do you get a perspective that doesn't have bias in it, right? Because even if you talk to if I took any one of you and I talked to people that knew you or worked with you or family, and I asked them perspectives about you, they're going to give me a different answer. So when I'm putting together a true crime story, let's say, or a nonfiction story, it's who I choose to tell me the story from their perspectives again. So there's bias in this, like, you know, so you talk about a killer and you talk about information you get from the people they worked with or their family or maybe their lovers at different times. And so you're kind of getting not exactly 100% truth. You're getting emotion out of people. And so that's the toughest thing to analyze and put down on paper, because am I just telling a story from a couple of people that didn't like the victim or didn't like the killer, whoever you're writing about, right? Or whatever part of it is. And you know, were they a bad employee and they caused trouble and nobody liked them? Therefore, you hear really bad stories about them. But that's not the whole picture. So trying to capture as much of that whole picture. And then, of course, then I have to worry about my own biases, because then when you see someone and hear something and see the way they treat a lover or an ex-lover or what they're doing in their life, you might think, wow, this is not a very nice guy. I don't like this guy. And you have bad feelings about them all the way around. But how I feel about them can't be what determines the story. So for me, that is the most difficult part. Just all of the different separating feelings from fact. And unfortunately, a lot of the old stories we do, like when James is even talking about the newspaper stuff, and you go through, who were the witnesses they were talking to at the time? 1920s murder of something involving homosexuals. They're not exactly going to be positive feedback. The cops aren't talking to people that like homosexuals. So a lot of your articles that you're drawing from are very negative toward the whole thing, just because we're dealing with, let's say, homosexuals or people of color and things like that. It's amazing, even when you look at the papers from 100 years ago, even how they talked about them in the newspapers it's just crazy. But that's what you have to draw your story from. So that is the most difficult thing in putting it together. And I will say, with In Cold Blood, it wasn't so much that it was inaccuracies. I think a lot of it is he was telling it again from his perspective. It was all about his love. his lust for someone, and it was all revolved around him, the story. So when you take it from that point of view, you're going to get his bias on a lot of things. So that's kind of how I see it in true crime. It's not exactly 100% on anybody's scale because you're dealing with witnesses.
Yeah, Bobby.
I think every writer, nonfiction writer, has a sort of line where they need to decide in their life whether or not they think literary truth or the truth or real truth is more interesting, and stick with it. Literary truth is like, Mr. Darcy and Emma get married at the end of the book and it feels right. Or like a fiction story where the lovers are chasing each other and the lover catches the train, the lover doesn't catch the train. Those are two different books. Both could be great books. If you're in the world if you occupy the space of the truth is the most interesting thing in the world, and you believe that like the limit of calculus, it's impossible to completely get there, but striving for it is worth it, then you enter the space and the terrain where you're doing you're doing a ton, half of the work, maybe even 60% of it, up to the point of is going to be research, frustrating, toiling research, where you're not getting enough sun in an archive, and you're talking to a lot of people and trying to glean in a lot of different perspectives, and you're reading things like insurance reports, and you're culling through newspaper stories, and you're trying to create a Venn diagram of overlapping evidence. So you can say, okay, I have 3 or 4 sources pointing to this one thing. This becomes then a gem I can use to arrange into a constellation. That is, and again, as Alan said, that is an example then of collage, and that is an act of wheat from chaff, choosing this, not that, what you want to highlight, what you don't want to highlight, and then from there, from my perspective, trying to use this to create a compelling and interesting book that make people want to learn about the thing they express interest in. I don't think that if someone expresses interest in an aspect of queer history, that it should be a trip to the dentist. I think that that there should be something rewarding about the book, that it could have an internal motor, that some aspects of plot can work in this genre, when you're very disciplined about how do you use evidence to reconstruct scenes. And then you're very deliberate with, I have what's a scene and what's exposition, meaning the stuff that goes in between the scene, and how do I do both well? Those all become the tactics, methods, possibilities for trying to angle at the truth without doing an intentional violation, going memoir, which everyone knows. I mean, I love memoir, but everyone knows the genre is truthy, right? And
Right.
it exists in the space of what seems emotionally right. And that's different from the frustrating aspect of the field that we exist in, where we're trying to create plots, we're trying to showcase setting, we're trying to assemble characters, and it all has to be close to 100% real, to the point where we don't have 2 people arguing in a room and then the lightning strikes right before the dramatic moment of dialogue, and they both pause and look, like that kind of thing. It can't operate and work that way if you think that the messiness of the way reality works is more fascinating than anything you could make up. And that's the space, at least I think most people in this genre are in and are loyal to, which they think that the mess, the chaos that we all have to learn how to negotiate as human beings is more fascinating and more fruitful to plumb than if I, within this scene, find like one detail that I need to add that would make it so perfect, like it would make it like a movie. That's not where it should be.
James, now I think you kind of tipped your hat on this one already because of something you said earlier, but what are your feelings?
Yeah, with Indecent Offenses, I feel like I wasn't striving to render the characters, or as I said, there are many stories here, and I wasn't trying to get at the psychologies or the motivations of any of the individuals in the book. I feel like I'm telling the story of the way kind of a meta here. I'm telling the story of the way the story was told, right, in the newspaper, right? So, and to Alan's point, right, there, all of that evidence, all those newspaper articles, I had to approach with a deep sense of suspicion about the facts of them, and I encountered many contradictions to get. One story tells these facts, another story tells those facts. It's a very strange experience, and I wanted to kind of represent that. Like, when do these stories become stories to be told and are publishable in a newspaper? And what are the codes that the press are using? When do those codes break down and they're much more explicit, say after World War II, when they're much more willing to note the victim was a homosexual, right? Whereas that wouldn't have happened so much before World War II. And so I'm trying to, at one point, trying to navigate these stories and tell them as richly as I can of these crimes, but also recognizing that my sources for this need to be looked at and taken with a grain of salt.
Yeah, that's really true. You have to interrogate the source, kind of. I mean, it isn't, like you said, I love that it's a story about the story of the sources a little bit, right?
Right.
That's great.
Right.
Okay, one thing I did want to, just chat a little bit about and point out, if it's not already obvious, we are 4 cis white gay,
Pretty white in here, pretty white.
and we unfortunately don't have Emma to at least add a little diversity to this panel. And I'll tell you, I think it's, I did really want to have a racially diverse, a gender diverse panel, but there's not a lot of published writing out there, at least, by POC true crime writers, by trans true crime writers. Talk a little bit about this. What are your thoughts about this? Why is this happening? By the way, if you're listening and you are, please contact me if I get a chance to do this panel again in some shape or form. I would love to include you. I think it's a problem. So I think we need to address that problem. And Bobby, I'll start with you since you mentioned it before.
I have a perspective on this. I think a lot of this has to do with the fact that the publishing business itself, right, especially with true crime, was built off of the mystery thriller phenomenon and genre, which is as larger than true crime. There's this presumption within the publishing industry that there's a certain kind of reader who reads true crime and mystery thriller. And so as a consequence, the publishing business, I'm not going to say every individual or editor, the publishing business is QPOC phobic and transphobic in their acquisition choices. So there are meetings, they usually happen on a Wednesday, they're catered, where editors sit down at conference group tables, nothing gets recorded, and even editors and agents and PR people who have sympathies that they're queer allies, they may even be QPOC or trans themselves, sit down together and they try to assess, based on acquisitions of manuscripts and proposals that they get, whether or not they think something has a shot to be commercially viable and will appeal to true crime readers. And in those meetings and in those contexts, queer people will diss on stuff that they've seen that I believe is being written by QPOC writers in the true crime space and by trans and non-binary writers in the true crime space that are just not being selected. Money is not being applied towards them. And then it becomes this self-fulfilling prophecy, unfortunately, where the publishing business says there is no market for something and there's no readership market for something. And then that's because they never select the author that would publish and sort of break the new market. And that sort of self-justifying business level, McKinsey consulting level form of discrimination is what it is, results in what I think is happening now is an entire generation of true crime writers are not being they're not being supported, and they're not being heard, and they're not being elevated because the industry itself isn't willing to recognize them, to elevate them, and to put the resources behind it. So I think actually it's an industry problem. That's my perspective on it.
When you think about who crime is done to, it's by far POC queer folk that end up being the victims and being, I think so that just seems like a huge problem. And it's interesting. I hope you're right that I see, in my little world of fiction that we do have, it is shifting some. We are having some POC thriller writers and mystery writers, really rising up and getting a lot of notoriety. So maybe there'll be something coming along, and that will be valued more. James, what do you think about this?
I think just to echo what Bobby said, I think there's this conversation which seems to be happening in publishing more and more now, to think about a more diverse editorial staff, to think about a more diverse list, that they bring out, and I also think that just the genre of true crime has been sort of limited over the years. It also comes with a kind of stigma, I think, that I think is changing, I think people like Sarah Weinman, who's doing interesting work where she's changing the way in which stories in true crime, what they look like, and thinking about victims, thinking about the cultural context that around crimes, stuff that we've been talking about here, but sort of forging ahead a new idea of the genre that might also bring in more voices in that process, because I think for a long time it's just been sort of a subgenre that hasn't had the greatest reputation.
Al, since you've been writing it, what do you think? What you've been writing this for a while?
Well, it's a lot of it's the people that make the decisions and where their head's at. That has to be it, and but it's still a cultural thing with crime and true crime. I mean, look at the when you see cases brought on TV and stuff like that, it's still very mainstream white. I look at the Gabby or Gabby, the van life girl, it's such a big deal, daily news about a girl going missing, and she's white, and it's just kind of look at how many black girls are missing and killed every day in the States, and nothing gets talked about. So there's just something about an image. So it's the people that are making these decisions, whether it's on television shows or books and stuff, there's still a lot of it. Their mindset is that it won't sell if it's not, mainstream white. And I think that's kind of a lot of the issues.
Alan, do you think it also has to do with how, for a couple centuries in the US, the law itself, since we're in the realm of crime, that has to do with human law, and law itself was for centuries created by, for, and to advantage white males.
Of course. And that you were the owner. The white male is the owner. We decide everything. Even back just in the 60s, your wife couldn't have a bank account unless you signed. This is just not that long ago. This is in my lifetime. So there's a lot of things, and a lot of these people are still in a lot of control over decision making and money, and they're very, very influential. It is changing. It is changing, but we're in the middle of it, so it seems very slow to us because it's month to month, day to day, year to year. But overall, it's changing, but it's very slow, very slow.
Well, guys, we are running up on the hour, but I think this is an amazing conversation. I hope all the conversations we've been having and topics we've been covering, but particularly this last one, I hope will continue to sort of roll on. And I would like to, cheer for some change and hear those voices and have a panel that, with all due respect, has a little more diversity. So I do want to shout out, please, folks listening, go buy these amazing books. You won't be sorry. There's a bookshop.org link, perhaps even in the feed, but certainly on the website. And thank you all so much for your thoughtful and insightful feedback. I think it's been a great conversation.
Thank you, John.
Thank you.
Take care, guys.